In August, I was hiking in Yellowstone National Park. It was a gorgeous day and also very calm as well. A few miles into the trail I was on, I noticed a bit of bush had started shaking just off the trail. I stood there and watched for a bit, thinking that there must be some birds or something in there. After a few seconds of watching though, thinking some neato wildlife could be in there, a large grizzly bear suddenly stepped out from behind that bush and started watching me very intently. As soon as he stepped out from behind it, I started talking to him. I had been singing aloud the entire hike. I was saying things like, "Hey there, Mr. Bear, I'm okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just out for a hike." I was mostly trying to prevent it from being startled and let it know I was not there to cause any harm, although I'm not sure it could entirely understand. I say it was a he because I didn't see any cubs nearby, and he also didn't charge at me and kill me immediately, so he probably was not nearby protecting any cubs. I stood there with my hand placed on my bear spray, talking to this bear until he finally wandered away from the trail, off toward a creek just off the side. I was headed east on the trail now, and after the bear walked off, I decided to keep on hiking and try to forget about that experience. About a mile later though, I started to suddenly get super creeped out. I don't know exactly what it was really, but I just felt the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stand up. It instantly felt like I was being watched. It was a totally creepy feeling. The wind had started to pick up a bit and was now whistling through the trees. There were noises, creaks and pops, almost everywhere around me. I stopped for a moment and started to take in my surroundings more intently. As I started looking around, I noticed there was a grizzly bear just feet away from me, staring at me from underneath a downed log. At this point, I was sure the bear was following me. I think it was hunting me. I don't know for sure though, because once it saw that I'd noticed it, he just kinda sauntered away. A few miles without thinking, I sat down for lunch. A peanut butter and honey sandwich with beef jerky. At that very moment, I realized I was a fucking moron. I was hiking alone, with bear spray sure, but no one knew where I was, and I knew for a fact the top predator in the area was following me. When I heard another rustling from the bushes again, I immediately packed all my shit up and left my food behind, and headed back for the trailhead. At 15 years old, I was walking home with a friend along a dark street with nothing but woods and a small community center on the left side. There was a school and some football pitches on the right as well. We had passed by the community center already, and the pitches. We were now passing the hill leading to the trees on the left, and the school on the right. The school had a big main building and this bike shed. Growing up, people would go drink there or hang out amongst other places, but you always knew the people who were there, so it was never really an issue. As we walked past on this particular night, we heard some voices. We could make out one of them shouting something along the lines of, "Here we go, guys, come on!" All of a sudden, about 10 people came out of the shed ahead of us and now started charging across the grass to the fence of the school, which was the only thing between them and us. They got to the fence and spread it out to jump over, some right at us, some behind, and some ahead. There was nothing to do but stop. "Where you off to, lads?" said one. "Aye, where you off to? Come on, get us into that party. You must know whose party it is, aye?" Something was always going on in the community center. It was a tiny thing, but it did karate classes, parties. Tonight, it happened to be a party. It seemed we had no choice. They guessed we were local and must know whoever's party it was. They wanted us to go up with them and try to get them in. At this point, one of the group had recognized my friend though, and the mood went from kind of hostile to neutral. Well, this was promising. He knew him, so maybe we were good actually. Fast forward, and the guy guarding the door would not let us in. Surprise, surprise. We were all standing in almost a circle when one of the group walked up and stood near enough in my face. "Who are you and where are you from?" I told him my name and he looked at me. right through me almost. I sensed the atmosphere immediately changed and tried to mumble something about being a nobody to save the confrontation. I don't give a fuck who you are or where you're from, I'm gonna fucking… One of his group jumped in right there. Wow, no, dude, he's cool, man, he's cool, not him. That was when I saw a shimmer of light reflecting off metal in his hand, and my heart sank. He was holding a blade about the size of my adult hand, pointing in against my stomach. He turned to his friend and they started arguing. My friend caught sight of it as well and mouthed for me to go now. He gave me the most haunting face as the fear within me made me wonder if my legs would even be capable of carrying me away from here. Fortunately, my friend was on it. In a stroke of genius, he told them that he had to go to the toilet. He grabbed me and we ran to the corner of the building, which was about 2 meters away. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Without even looking back, I could tell instantly the guy with the knife was now chasing us, as I could hear him shouting about how he was going to tear me open. The only thing that saved us from being gutted that night was that we knew the area better than him. We cut through the gardens of the houses up the road. That and his friend seemed to be more steady-headed and had noticed what he was about to do. I found out who this guy was afterward. He's currently serving time for multiple different crimes, including weapon offenses, theft, and drug charges. In case you didn't know, Scotland has a dark culture of idiots who think it's big to carry knives and stab people just because. Back at my old house, we had a very large fenced-in backyard. A large portion of this yard was very heavily wooded as well. I was around 6 years old and out playing in that backyard. I was a very explorative child and decided I would follow the fence all the way back just to see where my yard ended. Before this, I had always been too scared to go back there on my own. But it was around this age that I started to become too curious to be deterred by being scared. I walked out for a while until I finally reached the end of that fence. Where our gate line ended, someone else's began a couple of inches behind it. There was also a swing set a couple feet behind in their yard. I was more focused on, though, what I saw in my yard, which was a very large tree that had these huge nails about 6 inches long, stabbed in all the way to the top. This was just the perfect thing for climbing. As I started going up, though, I heard leaves being stepped on beneath me. I looked down, and in the opposite fenced-off area, I noticed 2 men standing there. They were about 25 to 30 years old, and I saw they were admiring me. Me being little, I just thought they must have thought I was cool with how high I had climbed up in the tree by myself. One man called over to me, "Wow, look at you go!" They stood there and watched me. I noticed there was now a little girl on the playset by their side as well. One of the men called out and asked me if I would like to come over and play with them. They told me they would help me over the fence if I couldn't make it on my own. I climbed down the tree, pondering over this. The other little girl just kind of blankly stared at me, lightly kicking her feet to make her swing go. I told them I would have to ask my mom if it was okay, but they kept on insisting, saying things like, No, it's fine. You're right behind your house after all. You can just play for a couple of minutes, right?" But I knew better. I ran off, heading back to my house to ask. I ran to the kitchen, asking my mom if I could play next door on their swing set. She thought about it for a moment and then said, "Fine," nodding her head towards our other neighbor's house. Now that I'm older, I know that she thought at the time I was asking to go to the other neighbors next door, who she could see from the window and we were all really good friends with. I ran back to the woods when I saw that one of the men was now gone, and so was the little girl. This made me rethink, because I didn't see the other girl now. I told the man I could not play. He reached his hands over the fence and offered to pick me up and lift me. He was acting very fake nice, but I could tell he was being very pushy now. Something in my head immediately started screaming stranger danger. I backed away slowly, and then I ran away, only looking back to see him staring at me as I ran away. After that, I never saw those neighbors again. I also never went back there. I was too scared. I didn't tell my mom about this because I thought I would get in a lot of trouble. A stupid kid thought process, I know. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had decided to go over to the other side. This one isn't supernatural or too weird at all. It's just sort of a natural part of being out in the woods. I was hunting in the eastern part of Texas a few years back. The area I was hunting in was really dense bottomland that hadn't been logged for at least 70 to 80 years, so we're talking about deep, dense woods. This stuff was a swamp for half the year, the kind you couldn't even really walk through without holding a machete. A typical morning for hunting in this area was to set up a stand in a natural or man-made clearing. I parked my four-wheeler a ways off and walked the last couple hundred yards. Now normally, these woods feel nice and welcoming to me. I'd been hunting this exact stand I was going to since I was probably around 8 years old, with an adult until I was legally allowed to hunt alone at least. I was very familiar with the area, needless to say. There are always birds chirping and squirrels making a racket at all times. Not today though. Once I arrived, I noticed it was dead silent, other than the wind shooting through the trees. The woods were never that quiet, unless it was right after a gunshot. I also noticed that I just couldn't shake this feeling that I was now being watched. I kinda think whatever, and blew it off and got up into the stand. It was basically a wooden box with openings on all sides on stilts, so it wouldn't get flooded when the river rises up. Although it was oddly quiet today, I sat back and just enjoyed being in the woods. I would usually read while I was in the stand, since you can usually hear something long before you ever see it. I sat there and read for a couple of hours, but I noticed that it was still just this completely abnormal silence around me. I was now a lot uncomfortable, to be frank, but no biggie, right? Finally, the sun goes down, without a single deer, hog, or anything showing up. I get out and head back to my wheeler. While I was walking back was one of the most unnerving experiences of my entire life. The woods are always quietest right after the sun goes down. The day critters are all going to sleep, and the night critters are just waking up, so there isn't much noise, but it was pitch silent. I hauled my ass getting out of there. I went back the next morning and everything was completely back to normal. Squirrels, birds, and bugs making noise all over the place. On my way back to the wheeler, I noticed something I hadn't noticed the day before. Running down the entire side of the trail were tracks, mountain lion tracks. I was stalked by a mountain lion that entire night. It had been a real bad year for the deer, and not a lot of fawns either. It had been a very dry year too, which meant that all the deer were down in the bottom, and not many up on the ridges where mountain lions normally like to hunt. This lion was outside its normal range because prey wasn't exactly abundant compared to normal times. I'd never heard of a mountain lion attacking someone in that area, but I very well may have been the first that day if I stayed any longer. I have a family friend who owns a beautiful and very old house in a wealthy suburb of a large city. She was going on vacation, and her husband was leaving for a business trip, so she asked if I could cat sit for her for that time. I had done it for her plenty of times before, and I adored the house and the area as well, so I readily agreed. The house appeared very small and quaint from the street, but was actually very rambling and had an extremely bizarre layout that never seemed to end. The basement was a walkout with 2 doors and 2 staircases that led to the main floor. The house was honestly so weirdly designed that you would find rooms and hallways and doors you didn't even realize existed, even after days of staying there. I spent most of my time in the front room of this home, which had a very large window facing the street and no curtains. One night, I was studying on the couch in the front room in front of the window. It was so pitch black out that I couldn't see anything outside, even though I was just inches away from that window. Suddenly, I started to feel extremely on edge and uncomfortable, like I was being observed or something. Around 2:30 a.m., I shut off all the lights in the house and retired to a small bedroom in the middle right side of the main floor, which had windows with blinds. I watched a few videos on YouTube, making sure to leave the door open just a crack. The cats like to come in and out throughout the night. I thought I had heard a male voice coming from the basement at one point in time, but I dismissed it as me just being creeped out, being alone in this old, rambling house. Around 3 a.m., I was finally ready to shut everything down and go to bed. For the first time in hours, the house was completely silent. I was no longer reciting information to myself during study or watching any loud videos. That silence, however, was fleeting. It was very quickly broken by what sounded like a very large man loudly stomping up the stairs from the basement. Thus began the most terrifying experience of my entire life, during which I was certain my life was going to end. This person was obviously not trying to creep around or be subtle or waste any time with those kinds of things. They made no attempt to hide the sound of their steps. In fact, it was the opposite. They were very deliberately and loudly clomping their way up the staircase, like they were supposed to be in this house at 3 a.m. Because of this, at first I thought perhaps the owner's husband had come home from his business trip early and didn't realize I was there watching the house. I called out, "Hello?" in a harsh, questioning way to indicate I was not expecting anyone to be there. I was hoping it was the husband and he would respond back, perhaps confused or apologetic for scaring me. Instead, though, there was dead silence. My voice rang out, and the steps immediately stopped. No words were spoken. I knew immediately something was wrong. I got up from the bed and stared at the crack in the door, waiting for anything to happen. Then, the timid female cat bolted into the room, meowing like crazy and winding around my legs, very distressed. This cat was so timid that she would run away from me at the slightest noise or movement, but now she was so spooked that she was running towards me for comfort. I knew then that whoever this was not someone this cat was familiar with, and therefore no one who had any business being in that house. I went to the bed and picked up my cell phone and called 911. I then picked up an iron, closed the bedroom door, and leaned heavily against it. This room had no lock, so I just had to hope they wouldn't be able to push their way in. I was on the phone with the operator, and pretty certain my life was going to end. I was shaking so hard that the door was rattling in the doorframe. At one point, the operator told me to listen to what was going on around me, so I forced myself to stop shaking so I could hear. When I heard movement, I began to shake again so the door would rattle. I wouldn't have to hear them walking around. If I was going to be killed by this person, I didn't want to go through the dread of hearing them walking slowly toward me. Eventually, the cops did show up. I had to dart out of the room and run to the front of the house to unlock the front door. They came in and spent all of 5 minutes searching this chaotically laid out, rambling house. One of them even commented, "The damn thing just keeps going," in disbelief. They didn't find anything. At first, I thought I must be going crazy. There was no question in my mind I'd heard those footsteps, but the police were telling me all the doors were locked. They ended up leaving quite soon. Because all of the rooms and furniture and weird little nooks and crannies in the house, though, I felt like a small 5-minute search was nowhere near enough to actually find someone who wanted to conceal themselves. I ended up calling my mother crying, and she came over. Then I realized something. The intruder would have walked right past my obvious pile of cash on the kitchen table, and that pile was untouched. This made me think they were not there to burgle. I've often wondered if the person had been waiting for me to go to sleep, hyping themselves up to come upstairs and do whatever the hell they were planning. Perhaps hearing me aggressively call out to them and call the cops deterred them that night. It terrifies me to think of what would have happened if I had just gone to sleep, or what that person was planning, having walked up those stairs so boldly, like it was obvious that someone was supposed to be home. We noticed the next day after checking that the laundry room window in the basement was wide open. Apparently, the police had not even noticed. I searched the news in that area online. There had been a break-in incident just weeks prior, where a woman woke up in the middle of the night to an intruder sitting in the dark watching her sleep. He then proceeded to badly assault her and sexually abuse her. I've been messed up over the whole thing since. The following story is 100% true. The years listed are the estimated dates that this story roamed free from me. It was the only time in my entire life I questioned my own sanity or my own perceptions. I ask that you listen to this in full, as this is one of the few cases where there's an actual ending to this story. I wanted to write this out because I believe this is something we can all learn from. Location: a mid-sized city located roughly 2.5 hours southwest of Chicago. The town sits right on the Mississippi River bordering the state of Iowa. The lady in the woods was sighted at a small park, smack dab in the middle of town. The park is surrounded by roughly 4 to 5 acres of timber. Sometime roughly in 1993 or 1994 was the first time I'd heard about the lady in the woods. I was in 5th grade hanging out with some other boys on the grade school grounds. The story was just your typical ghost story. At Male Park, our local hangout just blocks away, a child had gone missing after the sighting of a ghost. More specifically, the ghost of a woman dressed all in white. They didn't know the name of the child, but claimed it happened in 1987. Another boy chimed in. Apparently, there was also an adult who had gone missing the night after sighting this same ghost a few years later. In both cases, the sightings happened after the park closed well after midnight. The park was nestled in between neighborhoods, and there had even been reports of people who moved out of their homes after seeing the woman drifting through the woods. There were a bunch of other stories I heard in the years after that included witchcraft, Satan worshipping, kidnapping, murder, the occult. The story gained even more momentum when another boy in our class a few months later found a pentagram spray painted on a tree on a path near the park. We actually rode our bikes out to see it, and it was definitely there, crudely painted in what looked to be a real hurry. This was all one of those things, though, where there was no real way to know if all the parts of the story were connected or if they were just put there because of the story itself. When you're in 5th grade, though, you rarely stop to think those things through. You only see what's right in front of you, and what I was seeing was definitely creepy. May 1995. A friend of ours named Michael lived only a block away from Mel Park. His parents decided to allow him to have a sleepover for his birthday party. He invited 10 of us boys to stay the night, just doing what boys do. God bless those parents, by the way. That night, you can imagine where this thing is headed. Michael knew all about the Mel Park ghost stories. He lived the closest of all of us and had a neighbor who gave him all kinds of crazy information, or so he claimed. He rehashed a lot of the stories we had already heard, and even added a few others as well. After some time, as the clock made its way near 1 a.m., it finally happened. One of the boys suggested we sneak out and see if we could find this lady ghost. So, that's exactly what we did. We all hustled outside, quiet enough, and made our way to Mel Park. Once we arrived there, we broke out into groups. We walked into the overgrown Little League baseball field. A few headed toward the playground equipment near the only streetlight in the park. Myself and one other stayed in the lot nearest to Michael's house. Yes, we were the skittish ones. I wish I could give you all kinds of cool things we did, but real life is not that cool. Essentially, we just kind of walked around looking for ghosts and waiting. Really, we had only been there for maybe 10 to 15 minutes when it happened. I kid you not, exactly like the story within minutes of us showing up. It was like a Lifetime movie. I could see her. There she was in the woods to my north. I saw what looked like a pale white ghostly woman. White hair, white flowing clothes, and white pants. In the dark night, she seemed to glow. It was literally the perfect example of what you would think of as a ghost. I had never been so scared in my entire life. To this day, it's still the most terrifying moment I've ever been in. Everyone saw her too. All 10 of us. She stuck out like a sore thumb. We jetted immediately. I mean, we ran faster than any of us had ever run before. All of us were completely silent, sprinting towards Michael's home and safety. I could embellish here and tell you that she chased us, or made a move to float towards us or something. I could make it out like her head split in half and bees came flying out. But none of that happened. In fact, she wasn't even looking at us. She was facing a different way entirely. I don't believe the ghostly lady even knew we were there. Instead, she looked as if she was peering deeper into the woods. That was that. We all made it back safely. We spent the rest of the night worried this lady ghost was going to show up and kidnap us. Of course, she never did show. We returned to school and the Lady of the Woods became even more enshrined in legend. All of us shared the story. All of us backed each other up. We even told one of our teachers, who politely listened and then changed the subject. It was the coolest, most terrifying thing that ever happened to us. We had one of the best campfire ghost stories in history. Well, time passed on like it always does. We moved on from grade school to junior high, then to graduating high school. Once we got a bit older, the story took a backseat to girls and just living life. I wouldn't say it completely died down. We spoke of it in passing every now and then. I know the story continued on in grade school, at least for a short time after we left as well. One of the 10 boys from the birthday party died of suicide shortly after, and it took everything in me not to blame this ghost story on that situation. Now that I'm older though, I don't believe the two are really related. We all moved on to college. I lost touch with all but one of the 10, though I did have a few on Facebook. Now it was 2010. After coming home from college and struggling to find my way in life, I finally started to get my act together. I had a full-time job, married my now wife, got a dog, I even had a couple of kids as well. Eventually, we purchased our first home, which just so happened to be blocks away from my childhood house. I ended up in a tiny house 2 streets over from Mel Park. After those floating years, I ended up right back where it all started. On my days off, I would walk my dog in that very park where the Lady of the Woods had scared me almost to death all those years ago. This is where you really start to question yourself and your senses. At 27 years old, I would stare at the location where I'd seen her glowing all those years before and tried to make sense of what I had seen. Now older and wiser, you spend a lot more time trying to feel things out, rather than just reacting. How in the world did I see a ghost in 6th grade with 9 other people who saw the exact same thing? I know for sure it wasn't a dream. I wrestled with it for a long time, just trying to figure this all out. Summer of 2012, there I am on another walk with my dog, coming up alongside the timber where I'd seen the Lady in the Woods. I was thinking of her again, thinking of all my childhood friends, wondering if they ever thought of that moment too. The thought passed as I moved along a path that led me out of the park. In front of me, a large trailer hooked to a pickup sat in the driveway nearest the park's wooded area. There was a middle-aged man moving some things onto the trailer as I approached. He saw me and waved hello. I said hello back and then decided to make some small talk. I asked him if he was moving. The man responded that he'd just recently sold the home. It was his parents' house and it had sold to a young couple. Closing was coming up shortly. I mentioned a few other things and then started to head off, but I was stopped suddenly. That ghost story was still on my mind, so I decided to ask this man that I didn't know if he knew anything about that story. Why I did that is completely beyond me. It's definitely not something I would normally bring up in conversation. This house was the closest one to the sighting though, and I needed confirmation that somebody else out there knew this story. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I asked him if he'd ever heard the ghost stories around the area. I'll never in my remaining years forget what happened next. The man looked at me and smiled. He told me he'd heard those stories aplenty. I was actually relieved that he had because I didn't actually think through how the conversation would go if he had no clue what I was talking about. I then proceeded to give him the shortened version of the story you just read above. He listened very closely, and I could tell he was very interested. When I finished, he took a moment before responding. I used to live in this house before that park was built. My parents raised me here. I moved out in 1983 or 84, and my parents have been here ever since. My dad passed away in 91, and it was just my mom after that. That ghost you saw that night? That was my mom. I looked at him completely confused. He continued. My mom had some medical issues that started in the mid-80s and continued all the way up until she passed away this last spring. You see, the medicine they had her on would cause her to sleepwalk sometimes. I can't even count the amount of times I received calls in the middle of the night from the police department advising me they'd found my mother wandering around in the park. I was recently told one of the neighbors moved out because they were tired of all the commotion. My sister lives out in Texas, but I could never get it through her damn thick skull that our mom needed to be moved to assisted living, so this went on for years. I found out from some friends that she had become a ghost story to the park. My mom had a favorite robe that was all white, and she always slept in the same pearl silk pajamas. Everything was bright white. She even had white gloves she would put on too. I could only imagine what that would look like in the middle of the night with no light around. And that lamp over there, the playground would light her up like a Christmas tree. Never hard for the police to locate her. So, you see, that ghost you saw was just my mom sleepwalking. I bet I even got a call that night. I was speechless. The lady in the woods was real, but she wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't a dream. She was simply a woman. She was this man's mother, lonely and suffering some medical condition that had her wandering the woods unwillingly at night. I wish I knew more, and I wish I knew that at the time. I never saw that man again, and a new couple moved in, probably oblivious to those ghost stories its previous occupant had created. I wonder, does her legend still live on? Are there some 5th graders right now hearing that story for the first time? That story of the lady in the woods, how she appears and kidnaps children, how there's a witch who murders those who see her in the night. I wonder how she felt hearing all those stories about her. 2021. I moved from that house to a bigger house in a new city. I no longer visit Mel Park. I never did learn that lady's name, and I kicked myself for not asking the man more questions when I could. The thing I find most interesting is how a story can become what it is, how one event or story can impact individuals like it did me. I still think about that lady all the time. When a story rolls around that seems impossible or like paranormal activity, the lady in the woods comes immediately to mind. Sometimes the story is real, but the context is muddled. Now I try to listen. I take in all of the story if I can. If it seems impossible, I hold my tongue. Maybe it is impossible, or maybe the person who experienced it just didn't know what they were seeing. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope I helped you learn something with this story.